The million-dollar Boeing prototype, hidden in Maya Jefferson's messenger bag, was about to become the least of her problems. As Richard Sterling's manicured fingers closed around her throat at 30,000 feet, she couldn't know that his violent rage would trigger something far more catastrophic than a spilled scotch. The entitled executive saw only a poor college student who'd ruined his suit. He didn't see the aerospace engineer whose emergency gyroscopic device was the only thing standing between 180 passengers and a mechanical failure that would begin in exactly 47 seconds. When the engines suddenly died and the cabin lights flickered, Maya realized with chilling clarity the man trying to destroy her was about to desperately need her to save his life. Before anyone could even unbuckle their seatbelts to intervene, the cabin lights violently flickered. The engine roar died, and the entire plane seemingly stopped. Chicago O'Hare International Airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling luggage frustrated sighs and the overlapping sterile voices of intercom announcements. Gate B-12 was particularly miserable. Flight 482 to Seattle had been delayed by 45 minutes due to a vague maintenance issue, leaving the boarding area packed with irritated travelers. Sitting quietly near the frosted glass window was 22-year-old Maya Jefferson. She kept her hands resting protectively over a padded messenger bag resting on her lap. Inside was the culmination of 2 years of relentless work, a complex miniaturized gyroscopic prototype for her senior aerospace engineering thesis. She was flying out to present it to a panel at Boeing, a meeting that could secure her a career before she even graduated. Maya was exhausted. She had been running on black coffee and adrenaline for 3 days. But beneath the fatigue, a quiet, vibrant hope kept her posture straight. A few feet away, pacing with the aggressive energy of a caged predator, was Richard Sterling. Richard was 50, dressed in a bespoke charcoal brown suit that cost more than Mir's entire semester tuition. His wrist was weighed down by a platinum PC Philippe watch, which he checked every 30 seconds with an audible scoff. Richard was the executive vice president of a major commercial real estate firm, a man accustomed to the world bending to his schedule. He did not do delays, he did not do inconveniences, and he certainly did not do crowded public spaces. This is completely unacceptable. Richard barked into his phone, his voice carrying easily over the dull roar of the terminal. "I don't care what the ground crew says, Brenda. You call the Platinum desk and tell them I want miles compensated. Yes, all of them. These people are incompetent." Maya subtly shifted her gaze away from him, focusing on the tarmac. She had seen men like Richard before, men who walked through life expecting everyone else to act as their supporting cast. She just wanted to get on the plane, plug in her noise and selling headphones, and sleep until they hit the Pacific Northwest. Finally, the gate agent's microphone clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are now ready to begin boarding flight 482. We will start with our first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members." Richard snapped his phone shut, cutting off his assistant mid-sentence, and shoved his way to the front of the line, ignoring the dirty looks from a family standing nearby. Maya waited. She was in boarding group 5, ticketed for seat 32, EA middle seat in the absolute back of the aircraft. She didn't mind. She was just grateful the university had covered the fare. However, when she finally reached the scanner and placed her digital boarding pass on the glass, a loud, sharp beep echoed, and the light flashed red. The gate agent, a tired woman named Carol, frowned and typed rapidly on her keyboard. Maya's stomach dropped. "Please don't bump me," she prayed silently. "I cannot miss this meeting." "Miss Jefferson," Carol said, pulling a slip of thermal paper from a printer. "It looks like there was an equipment change, and your row in the back was removed to accommodate a larger galley. The flight is entirely full. I have to get to Seattle today." Maya said, her voice tight with panic. "I have a presentation." Carol offered a brief, exhausted smile. "You aren't bumped, honey. Because of the overbooking and economy, the system automatically bumped you up. You're in 3A first class. Enjoy the flight." Relief washed over Maya so intensely her knees felt weak. She thanked Carol profusely and walked down the jet bridge, feeling a rare stroke of good luck. Stepping onto the plane, she was greeted by the lead flight attendant, Sarah Jenkins, a 20-year veteran of the skies with a warm smile and sharp, observant eyes. "Welcome aboard. 3A is just right down here on the left," Sarah directed. Maya found row 3. The window seat was empty, waiting for her. But sitting in 3B, the aisle seat already sipping a pre-departure glass of sparkling water, was Richard Sterling. He had his suit jacket neatly folded on the armrest, his expensive leather briefcase taking up half the footwell of Mir's seat, and his elbows spread wide. "Excuse me," Mia said softly, offering a polite smile. "I'm in the window seat." Richard looked up from his tablet. He looked at Maya, at her worn denim jacket, her scuffed Converse sneakers, and her heavy canvas messenger bag. His eyes did a slow, calculating sweep, and his upper lip curled into a microscopic sneer. He didn't say a word. He didn't stand up to let her in. Instead, he simply shifted his knees about 2 inches to the right, forcing Mia to awkwardly squeeze past him, her bag brushing against his shoulder. "Watch the suit," Richard snapped, sharply brushing his shoulder, as if she had left a layer of grime on the fabric. "Sorry," Maya muttered, slipping into her seat. She carefully placed her bag under the seat in front of her, gently nudging his leather briefcase to the side to make room for her feet. Richard let out a dramatic, breathy sigh of supreme irritation. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. He flagged down Sarah as she walked past. "Excuse me, flight attendant, are you sure she's in the right cabin?" Usually upgrades are reserved for actual frequent flyers. Sarah's customer service smile tightened just a fraction. "Miss Jefferson's ticket is perfectly in order, sir. Can I get you anything else before takeoff?" "Just peace and quiet," Richard said, glaring at the side of Ma's head, though apparently standards are dropping across the board. Maya swallowed hard, keeping her eyes fixed on the rain starting to streak the window pane. 2,000 miles, she told herself. Just ignore him for 2,000 miles. She reached into her bag, pulled out her headphones, and placed them over her ears. She didn't play any music. She just needed the barrier. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the tension in row 3 was palpable. It was a thick, suffocating aura of hostility radiating off Richard. He took up the shared armrest, completely his elbow, frequently bumping into Mia's ribs, as he aggressively scrolled through emails on his tablet. Maya shrank into herself, pressing her shoulder against the cold fuselage of the plane, trying to occupy as little space as physically possible. Flight 482 breached the heavy cloud cover over Illinois, breaking into the blinding, serene sunlight of the upper atmosphere. The captain turned off the seatbelt sign with a double chime, signaling the cabin crew to begin their service. Maya had managed to drift into a light, uneasy doze, her head resting against the window. Next to her, Richard had spread out a series of legal documents on his tray table, tapping his expensive pen against the plastic with a rhythmic, irritating clack, clack, clack. Sarah Jenkins and another flight attendant rolled the beverage cart down the aisle of the premium cabin. The smell of warmed mixed nuts and fresh coffee filled the air. "Mr. Sterling, your usual?" Sarah asked politely. "Scotch neat with a glass of water on the side." "Make it a double," Richard said, without looking up from his papers. "And make sure the glass is actually clean this time." Sarah handed him the drinks, placing them carefully on the small cocktail tray extending from the center console. She turned to Maya. "And for you, Miss Jefferson, juice coffee." Maya slipped one headphone off. "Just a ginger ale, please. Thank you." As Sarah reached for a plastic cup, the aircraft hit a pocket of clear air turbulence. It wasn't a massive drop, just a sudden sharp lateral jolt that shook the entire frame of the 737. Maya gasped, her hands instinctively flying to her lap to steady her messenger bag. In doing so, her elbow bumped the center armrest. It was a light touch, an accident of physics and gravity. But it was enough. The jolt of the plane, combined with a slight bump to the armrest, sent Richard's double scotch toppling over. The amber liquid splashed directly onto his tray table, soaking into his legal documents and cascading down into his lap, pooling on the fabric of his expensive charcoal trousers. For a second, the cabin was dead silent. The only sound was the steady drone of the jet engines and the dripping of alcohol onto the carpet. Richard slowly looked down at his ruined trousers, then at his soaked, ink-bleeding contracts. His face, previously a mask of entitled boredom, flushed a dark, violent crimson. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. "Look what you did!" He hissed, his voice low, and vibrating with pure rage. Maya's eyes went wide. I'm so sorry." The plane shook. "I didn't mean to." She reached for a napkin from Sarah's cart to help him dry off. "Don't touch me." Richard roared, his voice suddenly booming through the quiet cabin. Several passengers in the rows behind them jumped. He violently slapped Mia's hand away. The smack echoed sharply. Mia recoiled, pressing herself hard against the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hey, don't hit me, you stupid, clumsy little brat," Richard shouted, completely losing his veneer of corporate sophistication. He unbuckled his seatbelt and half stood towering over her in the confined space. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? Do you know what these documents are? You don't belong up here. You belong back in coach with the rest of the trash." Sarah Jenkins instantly shoved the heavy beverage cart forward, wedging it against the row ahead to clear the aisle, and stepped quickly toward Richard. Sir, I need you to lower your voice and sit down right now." "Shut up!" Richard snapped at Sarah, pointing a trembling finger at Mir. "This idiot just ruined $1 million deal because she can't control her limbs. I want her moved now, Mr. Sterling." "It was turbulence," Sarah said firmly, maintaining her authoritative composure. "It was an accident. Please take your seat, or I will have to inform the captain." "Tell the captain." Richard sneered, his spit flying. "Tell him to land the damn plane and have her arrested for assault." "She hit my arm on purpose. I felt her do it." "That is a lie." Maya finally fired back, finding her voice. Her hands were shaking, but she looked him dead in the eye. The plane dropped. "I didn't even touch your glass, and you have absolutely no right to put your hands on me." Hearing her fight back seemed to snap the last remaining thread of Richard's control. He lunged across the armrest, his large hand clamped down around Mia's upper arm with a bruising, terrifying force. He yanked her toward him, pulling her away from the safety of the window. "You listen to me, you little—" "Hey, let her go!" The shout came from seat 4. Directly behind them, Thomas Gregson, a broad-shouldered man in a flannel shirt, unbuckled his seatbelt and vaulted up. He grabbed Richard by the shoulder of his damp suit jacket and hauled him backward with tremendous force. Richard stumbled into the aisle, breaking his grip on Mia. Mia gasped in pain, rubbing her arm, tears of shock finally prickling her eyes. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Thomas demanded, placing himself firmly between Richard and the seats. "You don't put your hands on a woman. Sit down and shut your mouth before I make you." The entire first-class cabin was now in an uproar. Passengers were standing, phones were being pulled out to record the altercation, and shouts of indignation filled the air. He grabbed her. A woman in row 2 yelled, "I saw the whole thing." Sarah unclipped the intercom phone from the wall panel. "Captain, we have a level 2 physical disturbance in first class. Passenger in 3B has assaulted 3A. Richard, breathing heavily, straightened his ruined jacket. He looked around at the glaring faces, but instead of showing remorse, his arrogance doubled down. "I am a Platinum Medallion member. I fly 300,000 meters a year. You," he jabbed a finger at Thomas, "are threatening me, and she," he pointed at Mayer, "assaulted me first. I'm suing this airline, and I'm ruining all of your lives." He took a step forward, raising his fists as if preparing to fight Thomas in the middle of the narrow aisle. Thomas braced his legs, ready for the impact, but the impact never came. Instead, a bizarre metallic groaning sound resonated through the floorboards of the Boeing 737. It sounded like the grinding of massive gears. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a harsh, repetitive chiming that didn't stop. Then, the steady, deafening roar of the twin jet engines. The sound that provides the constant background noise to every flight suddenly sputters. A heavy, terrifying shudder violently rocked the aircraft. The overhead bins rattled aggressively, and then silence. Absolute impossible silence. The engines had completely shut down. The ambient hiss of the air conditioning died. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the cabin into emergency auxiliary lighting. The plane didn't instantly nosedive, but the sickening sensation of weightlessness began to creep into the stomachs of every soul on board. They were 30,000 feet in the air, and they were gliding. Richard froze his fist, still raised in the air. His anger vanished, instantly replaced by a stark, primal terror. He looked toward the window. The cockpit door violently burst open. Captain David Mitchell stood in the threshold, his face devoid of color, his eyes wide with a fear that flight simulators never train you to hide. He wasn't looking at the fight. He wasn't looking at Richard or Maya. He was looking at the empty air in front of him, and he whispered something that the dead, silent cabin heard with crystal clarity. "We just lost everything." There is a specific kind of silence that exists only at 30,000 feet, when the engines of a commercial airliner stop burning fuel. It is not a true silence, but rather an eerie, hollow rushing sound. The noise of 150 tons of aluminum tearing through the thin atmosphere without propulsion. For the first 5 seconds after Captain Mitchell's chilling announcement, nobody moved. The brain requires time to process an impossibility. A Boeing 737 does not simply power down mid-flight like a laptop with a dead battery. Then, the gravity of the situation literally set in. The nose of the aircraft dipped. It wasn't a violent plunge, but a sickening, steady incline downward. The sensation of weightlessness gripped the cabin, lifting stray napkins and plastic cups off the tray tables, letting them hover for a fraction of a second before gravity reclaimed them. The emergency lighting cast long, sickly yellow shadows across the terrified faces of the passengers. Richard Sterling, the man who had just seconds ago been threatening to ruin lives with his wealth and status, collapsed back into seat 3B. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. The anger that had contorted his features vanished, instantly replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. What did he say?" Richard stammered, his hands trembling so violently that his expensive Patek Philippe watch rattled against his wristbone. "What does he mean we lost everything?" "Tell him to turn it back on." Thomas Gregson, the broad-shouldered man in row 4 who had pulled Richard away from Mir, ignored him. He leaned forward, his voice tight but remarkably level. "Sarah. What do you need us to do, Sarah Jenkins?" The veteran flight attendant swallowed hard. The customer service smile was gone, replaced by the steely, drilled focus of a first responder. "Everyone remain seated. Fasten your seatbelts tight. Do not move." A loud mechanical thud resonated from beneath the fuselage, followed by a high-pitched whining roar that sounded like a giant blender spinning up outside the window. "What is that? Are we breaking apart?" a woman in row 2 screamed, clutching her armrests. "It's the ram air turbine," Maya yelled over the noise, her voice surprisingly steady. Every eye in first class, including Richard's, darted to her. The aerospace engineering student's mind was racing, overriding her fear with hard data. It's a little propeller that drops down from the belly of the plane when the engines fail. It catches the wind to generate emergency electrical and hydraulic power. It means we can still steer. Captain Mitchell rushed back into the cockpit, slamming the reinforced door behind him. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed frantically, powered by the rat's emergency reserves. "We're gliding," Maya whispered to herself, looking out the window. Below them, a thick, impenetrable blanket of dark gray storm clouds obscured the ground. They were somewhere over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Next to her, Richard began to hyperventilate. The man who owned skyscrapers, who commanded boardrooms, who viewed the people around him as nothing more than obstacles or assets, was suddenly stripped of all his power. In the face of gravity, his platinum medallion status was useless. His bank account could not buy them altitude. "I can't breathe," Richard gasped, clawing at his silk tie, ripping it loose. "I'm having a heart attack. I demand to see a doctor." "Get the oxygen masks." "Why aren't the masks dropping?" "Because the cabin hasn't depressurized you." "Idiot," Thomas barked from behind him. "Shut up and brace yourself." "I don't want to die," Richard wailed. Tears began to stream down his face, cutting tracks through the nervous sweat gathering on his cheeks. He reached out his hand, shaking, and grabbed the sleeve of Mare's denim jacket. "Please, please, you know what's happening? Tell them to fix it. I'll pay you. I'll pay them. I have money." Maya looked down at the hand gripping her jacket, the same hand that had violently grabbed her arm just 3 minutes prior. The irony was suffocating. "Let go of me," Maya said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a cold, absolute authority. Richard pulled his hand back, as if he had been burned, retreating into his seat, curling his knees up toward his chest like a frightened child. He began to pray, loudly and incoherently, begging for a salvation his wealth could not secure. Suddenly the intercom crackled to life. It wasn't the captain, but First Officer Greg Collins. His voice was laced with a frantic edge of panic urgency that shattered any remaining illusion of safety. Sarah, get on the interphone now." Sarah yanked the handset from the bulkhead. Though she didn't broadcast the audio over the PA, the silence in the cabin allowed the first officer's shouting through the earpiece to be faintly heard by those in the front rows. "Sarah, the EMP cascade fried the backups. The glass cockpit is dead. We have no screens, no horizon line. The standby instruments are locked up. We're in the soup. We can't see the ground, and we don't know our pitch. If we hit these clouds blind, we're going to put her into a sun." Sarah's face went chalk white. She slowly lowered the receiver. She looked at Thomas, then at Ma. "They're flying blind. The instruments are dead." Maya's breath caught in her throat. Without an artificial horizon or an attitude indicator, a pilot flying through thick clouds loses all spatial orientation within minutes. The inner ear plays tricks on the brain. You can be banking violently to the left or diving straight toward the earth, and your body will swear you are flying perfectly level. It's called a graveyard spiral, and it was about to kill every single person on Flight 482. Maya looked down at the padded messenger bag, resting between her scuffed Converse sneakers. The prototype. Her senior thesis wasn't just a theoretical model. It was a fully functional miniaturized independent gyroscopic navigation array. It had its own lithium-ion battery supply entirely detached from the aircraft's fried electrical grid. It contained military-grade accelerometers, a solid-state altimeter, and a digital artificial horizon designed to perfectly map spatial orientation in zero-visibility conditions. It was designed for deep space satellites, but physics were physics. "I have an artificial horizon," Maya said, her voice slicing through the whimpering sounds coming from Richard. Sarah looked at her confused. "What in my bag?" Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and dropped to her knees in the narrow space, ignoring Richard, who was now sobbing openly into his hands. She unzipped the heavy canvas bag and pulled out a metallic cube-shaped device about the size of a toaster. It was encased in clear acrylic, a complex web of wiring gimbals, and a high-resolution LCD screen. Maya flicked a toggle switch on the side. The device hummed to life, the screen glowing a brilliant crisp blue and brown, displaying a perfect stable horizon line and digital altitude readouts. "My God," Thomas whispered, leaning over the seat. "I need to get this to the cockpit," Maya said, standing up, clutching the prototype to her chest. "You can't go in there. It's against FAA regulations," Sarah said instinctively, moving to block the aisle. Maya shouted her eyes, locking onto the flight attendants with desperate intensity. "If they don't know our pitch, we are going to dive into a mountain in less than 4 minutes. This device has its own battery. It knows exactly where we are in space. Let me in." Another severe shudder racked the plane as it punched into the thick layer of storm clouds. Instantly, the view out the windows vanished into a swirling, violent gray. The cabin grew darker. The plane banked sharply to the right, throwing Maya against the armrest. "We're already banking," Mia yelled. "They don't know they're turning open the door." Sarah didn't hesitate anymore. She punched the emergency override code into the keypad next to the cockpit door. A red light flashed to green, and the heavy door clicked open. Maya shoved her way inside. The cockpit was a terrifying sight. The massive digital screens that usually displayed the plane's telemetry maps and engine data were completely black. The analog backup dials in the center console were frozen, their needles stuck in useless positions. The only light came from the lightning flashing outside the windshield, illuminating the thick gray soup of the clouds. Captain Mitchell was hauling back on the yoke, his arms corded with tension, sweat pouring down his face. First Officer Collins was frantically flipping breakers, trying to reboot the dead systems. Pull up. I think we're diving, Mitchell yelled. I don't know. I can't see the horizon. The standby attitude indicator is jammed, Collins shouted back. Captain, Maya screamed over the roar of the wind hitting the windshield. Both men jumped, startled by the civilian suddenly standing between their seats. Get out of here, Collins roared. Look at this. Maya thrust the heavy prototype right into the center pedestal, wedging it between the thrust levers and the radio panels. It's an independent gyroscopic array. It has its own power. Look at the screen. Mitchell's eyes darted down to the glowing LCD display of Mir's device. The digital horizon line was tilted severely to the right, and the pitch was angled downward at 10 degrees. The altitude numbers on the side were ticking down at a terrifying speed. You're in a 15-degree right bank and descending at 3,000 feet per minute, Maya yelled, reading her own device. You're entering a spiral. Mitchell, a pilot with 30 years of experience, didn't question where the machine came from or who the girl was. He recognized a lifeline when he saw one. He trusted the instrument. Correcting Mitchell, shouted. He muscled the heavy yoke to the left, stepping hard on the rudder pedals. On Mayer's screen, the digital horizon slowly leveled out. The terrifying G-forces that had been pressing the passengers into their seats eased as the wings leveled. Mitchell pulled back gently, bringing the pitch up. Wings level, pitch is 3 degrees nose up, Maya called out, acting as an impromptu flight engineer. Altitude is 18,200. It's working, Collins breathed, staring at the little glowing box. He looked up at Maya, his eyes wide with shock and profound gratitude. Who the hell are you? I'm the girl from seat 3A, Maya said, her knuckles white, as she gripped the back of the pilot's seats to steady herself. Outside the cockpit in first class, the violent banking had ceased. The plane was still gliding still, without engine power, but the sickening feeling of an uncontrolled dive was gone. They were stable. Richard Sterling peeked out from between his fingers. He looked at the empty seat next to him. The young woman he had insulted, belittled and physically assaulted, was currently standing behind the closed cockpit door, holding the very device he had almost stepped on, keeping him alive. The karma was absolute as the aircraft glided silently through the storm. Richard gripped his armrests, a profound, crushing realization washing over him. His survival was entirely in the hands of the person he had treated like garbage. Airspeed is 240 knots, Mitchell said, his voice returning to a calm, professional cadence, now that he had a horizon to fly by. Collins, we need a place to put this thing down. We don't have the altitude to make Seattle, and we can't clear the Cascades without engines. Where are we? Collins grabbed a heavy physical binder from the side pocket, the emergency sectional charts. He flipped frantically through the paper maps, calculating their glide ratio against their last known GPS coordinates. We're over eastern Washington, Collins said, tracing a finger over the map. Lots of mountains. But wait, there's an old decommissioned Air Force base, Moses Lake. It has a massive runway, built for heavy bombers. If we keep this hidden, we might just have the glide slope to reach it. Give me a vector, Mitchell ordered. He glanced at Mir's prototype, adjusting the trim wheel to maintain the optimal glide speed. And kid, keep calling out those numbers. Don't take your eyes off that screen. Yes, sir, Maya said. She stood firm, the glowing light of her life's work illuminating the dark cockpit, guiding 150 souls through the blind, unforgiving sky. Inside the freezing cockpit, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and nervous sweat. The Boeing 737 was essentially a 150-ton glider sinking through the sky at 2,000 feet per minute. Outside the reinforced windshield, the storm raged, battering the fuselage with heavy rain and localized hail that sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the aluminum hull. Mir's arms were trembling. Holding the 10-pound acrylic box steady between the thrust levers required a brutal isometric exertion, but she didn't dare shift her weight. Her eyes remained locked on the glowing LCD screen, her voice hoarse but steady as she continuously fed Captain Mitchell the data he needed to keep them from rolling into a fatal dive. Pitch is 2 degrees down. Wings are level. Altitude passing 14,000. Maya called out, blinking sweat out of her own eyes. Copy that. Speed is bleeding off slightly. 220 knots, Mitchell responded. His hands gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. Collins talked to me about Moses Lake. Where is the runway? First Officer Greg Collins had his face buried in the emergency sectional charts, calculating their trajectory with a manual flight computer, a circular slide rule known as an E6B. Grant County International Airport runway 32R. It's 13,000 feet long. It was an old strategic air command base for B-52 bombers. If we break out of this cloud deck at 3,000 feet, it should be directly off our nose. But Dave, we only get one shot. There are no go-rounds without engines. I know, Mitchell said grimly. We're coming in heavy. Have Sarah prep the cabin for a hard landing manual gear extension on my mark. Back in first class, the atmosphere had devolved into a chilling, suffocated panic. The emergency lighting cast long, wavering shadows. Passengers were gripping hands across the aisles, heads bowed in silent prayers. In seat 3, B. Richard Sterling was completely broken. The immaculate charcoal bio-known suit was tamed with scotch and drenched in his own cold sweat. The aura of corporate invincibility that usually shielded him from the world had evaporated the moment the engines died. He was no longer an executive vice president. He was just a terrified, powerless man trapped in a metal tube. Thomas Gregson, the man who had defended Mia, watched Richard with a mixture of disgust and pity. "I have a daughter." Richard suddenly whispered, his voice cracking, staring blankly at the seat back in front of him. It was the first time he had spoken in 10 minutes. "I missed her graduation last week. I was closing a commercial lease in Denver. A lease." "My God, what have I done?" Thomas didn't respond immediately. He tightened his seatbelt across his waist. "You should have thought about what matters before you put your hands on that girl, buddy." Richard looked toward the closed cockpit door. The realization of his profound arrogance was a physical weight on his chest. The young black student he had demanded be thrown out of first class. The girl whose life he had threatened to ruin was currently the only reason he was still breathing. Karma wasn't just knocking. It had kicked the door off the hinges. "I'm going to die in the dark." Richard choked out a sob, racking his broad shoulders. "All my money. It doesn't mean a damn thing right now. I can't buy my way out of this." Sarah Jenkins moved down the aisle, her hands gripping the seatbacks to steady herself against the turbulence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice projecting with drilled authority over the howl of the wind rushing past the fuselage. "The captain has informed me we are preparing for an emergency landing. When I give the command, you will assume the brace position. You will stay down until the aircraft comes to a complete and total stop. Altitude is 4,000 feet. Maya shouted over the deafening roar of the storm. 3800 pitch is locked at 2 degrees down, but our airspeed is climbing 230 knots. Inside the freezing cockpit, the air had turned brutally cold. Without the engines running to bleed hot air into the environmental systems, the temperature was plummeting. Maya could see her own frantic breaths puffing into white mist in the dim glow of the prototype screen. The Boeing 737 was a 150-ton metal dart falling through the sky, and the storm outside was not giving them an inch of mercy. Heavy rain lashed against the reinforced windshield, sounding like handfuls of gravel being fired from a shotgun. "We need to see the ground." "Collins." Captain Mitchell yelled, his forearms corded with thick veins as he fought the heavy, sluggish yoke. Without powered hydraulic steering, the massive aircraft felt like driving an 18-wheeler through thick mud with no power steering. "The altimeter is unwinding way too fast. Drop the gear." First Officer Greg Collins abandoned the paper sectional charts and unbuckled his shoulder harness. He lunged for the manual gear extension handles, located beneath a panel on the floor. With the electronic systems dead, pushing a button wouldn't do a thing. He had to rely on gravity and brute mechanical force. Collins grabbed the heavy steel rings and pulled upward with every ounce of strength in his back. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then a massive, sickening clunk reverberated through the floorboards, shaking the entire frame of the aircraft. It was followed immediately by a terrifying hollow roar as the belly doors ripped open into the 200 miles per hour slipstream. The main landing gear and the nose wheel fell out of their bays, dropping into place by pure gravity and locking into the struts. "Gear is down," Collins shouted, falling back into his seat and strapping in tightly. He pointed a trembling finger at the dark instrument panel. "But I have no green lights. The indicators are totally dead. We have no way of knowing if the pin's actually locked." "Then we trust gravity," Mitchell roared back. His eyes locked on the empty gray void outside the window. "Call out the altitude, kid. 3200. Maya yelled, her arms shaking so violently she had to brace her elbows against her ribs to keep the glowing prototype steady. "We're sinking fast." Back in the first-ass cabin, the eerie whistling of the wind tearing over the unpowered fuselage was the only sound besides the ragged weeping of terrified passengers. The air had grown frigid. Oxygen masks hadn't deployed because the cabin hadn't depressurized, leaving everyone fully conscious and horrifyingly aware of their impending impact. In seat 3, Richard Sterling was curled into the smallest ball his large frame would allow. He was gripping his armrest so hard his fingernails were digging into the cheap plastic. He was whispering rapidly, bargaining with a god he hadn't spoken to in decades, offering his firm his stock options, his vacation homes, anything just to feel solid earth again. Brace, brace, brace. "Heads down, stay down." Sarah Jenkins' voice echoed over the emergency megaphone, piercing the chaos with absolute drilled authority. Across the cabin, 150 people folded forward, burying their heads between their knees, wrapping their arms tight over their skulls. Thomas Gregson threw his broad body forward, shielding his head, bracing his boots against the seat in front of him. 2,800 feet, Mia screamed in the cockpit. Suddenly, the swirling, impenetrable gray soup outside the windshield began to tear apart in violent shreds. The heavy, oppressive darkness of the storm clouds fractured, giving way to the sprawling, flat agricultural landscape of the Columbia Basin. "I have visual," Colin screamed, pointing frantically out the right side of the window, his voice cracking with pure adrenaline. "They're 1000 Moses Lake." Through the driving rain and the mist, the massive expanse of Grant County International Airport materialized like a concrete ghost. Runway 32R was a colossal strip of pavement stretching 13,000 feet into the distance. Built during the Cold War for B-52 bombers and later used for Boeing heavy flight testing, it was one of the few places on Earth that could accommodate a dead-stick landing of this size. But it was approaching terrifyingly fast. "I see it. I have the runway," Mitchell said. His voice instantly dropped into a low, chillingly calm register. The panic vanished, replaced by 30 years of muscle memory. "Maya, get out of there. Leave the box. Strap into the jump seat right behind me. Put the 5-point harness on and pull the straps until it hurts." Now Maya didn't hesitate for a microsecond. She wedged the heavy acrylic prototype securely between the thrust levers so it wouldn't become a lethal projectile upon impact. She scrambled backward, throwing herself into the small folding jump seat attached to the cockpit bulkhead. She violently snapped the heavy metal buckles over her shoulders and across her waist, yanking the nylon straps so tight they bruised her collarbones. The 737 was coming incredibly hot. Because they had no engine power, they couldn't deploy the wing flaps to their full extension to create drag and lower their stall speed. If they flew too slow, they would drop like a stone. They were going to hit the concrete at well over 200 miles per hour, nearly 40 meters an hour, faster than a normal landing. Over the threshold, Collins yelled, 50 feet. The ground rushed up to meet them with terrifying, blurring speed. The wet concrete of the runway filled the entire windshield. Flaring. Mitchell grunted, hauling back on the heavy yoke, with both arms pulling the nose of the massive aircraft up at the very last possible second to let the rear wheels take the brunt of the impact. Crash. The main landing gear slammed into the concrete with an apocalyptic bone-shattering force. The entire airframe violently bowed and groaned under the extreme stress. In the cabin, the overhead bins immediately burst open under the G-force. Heavy carry-on bags, laptops, and coats rained down into the aisles. Maya's teeth slammed together, a sharp pain shooting straight up her spine as the jump seat absorbed the brutal compression. The nose wheel slammed down a split second later with a deafening bang. Brakes. I have no anti-skid. Hold her straight, Mitchell roared, practically standing up out of his seat as he stomped down on the mechanical brake pedals with both boots. Without engines, they had no reverse thrust to slow them down. Without computerized hydraulics, they had no anti-skid system to pump the brakes. The massive rubber tires instantly locked up tight against the abrasive runway. The tires shrieked against the wet tarmac, a high-pitched, agonizing wail of friction. Thick, acrid white smoke instantly billowed past the passenger windows as the rubber literally began to melt and shear off onto the concrete. The plane fishtailed violently, the heavy tail whipping aggressively to the left. Rudd-Right Rudder Collins screamed, pushing his own feet into the pedals to help his captain fight the sheer mass of the sliding airplane. The sound inside the cabin was deafening. A chaotic, terrifying symphony of screaming metal, rattling plastic, and the roar of violent friction. A tire on the right main gear blew out. It sounded like a howitzer cannon detonating directly underneath the floorboards. Sparks showered into the heavy rain as the bare-forged aluminum wheel rim ground directly into the concrete, carving a deep, burning, fiery gouge down the center line of the runway. "Hold her," Mitchell yelled, sweat flying from his forehead. The runway distance markers flashed by the windows in a blur. 5,000 feet remaining. 3,000. The plane was shuddering so violently it felt as though the wings were going to snap right off the fuselage. The smell of burning rubber hydraulic fluid and hot metal flooded the cabin, choking the air. 1,000 feet. The speed was finally bleeding off 100 knots. 50 knots with a final violent lurch that threw every passenger hard against their seatbelts and whipped Mears' head forward. The Boeing 737 shuddered, groaned like a dying beast, and finally ground to a dead, smoking, tilted halt. Total silence returned. For a span of 5 seconds nobody breathed. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the Washington rain against the aluminum roof, the hiss of the overheated brakes, and the ragged, exhausted gasping of the 3 people in the cockpit. Captain Mitchell slowly let go of the yoke. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't grasp the buckle to unhook his own harness. He slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder at Maya. She was pressed back against the jump seat, her eyes wide, staring at the ceiling of the cockpit, realizing she was still alive. "Kid." Mitchell whispered, his voice, thick tears finally mixing with the sweat on his face. "You just saved 150 lives." The evacuation was a chaotic, adrenaline-fueled blur of screaming wind and flashing emergency lights. The bright yellow inflatable slides hissed as they violently deployed from the forward and overwing exits, slapping against the freezing rain's concrete of the Moses Lake runway. Passengers tumbled out into the biting Washington storm, sprinting away from the smoking, groaning carcass of the Boeing 737. Grant County Sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and local fire engines, having tracked the massive aircraft dropping off primary radar, were already tearing across the expansive tarmac, their sirens piercing the heavy night air. Maya slid down the forward chute, clutching her heavy canvas messenger bag tightly to her chest like a shield. The moment her scuffed Converse boots hit the wet, muddy grass beyond the runway shoulder, her legs completely gave out. She collapsed to her knees in the freezing rain, taking in deep, ragged gasps of air. Her arms ached with a deep, burning lactic acid buildup from holding the heavy prototype steady for so long, and her chest heaved as the sheer terror of the last 20 minutes finally caught up with her. A few yards away, the passengers of first class were being herded under a large temporary triage tent set up by the first responders, wrapping themselves in silver Meyer thermal blankets. Richard Sterling was among them. His immaculate charcoal Bayon suit was a destroyed, soot-stained ruin clinging to his shivering frame. His expensive leather shoes were caked in mud. Yet, as the immediate primal fear of death began to recede, Richard's deeply ingrained instincts, the desperate pathological need to assert control and superiority over his environment, began to claw their way back to the surface. He looked around at the shivering, traumatized passengers and felt only a profound annoyance at the inconvenience of it all. Spotting the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers, Richard threw off his Meyer blanket. He marched right past a paramedic who was trying to check his blood pressure, stomping toward a high-ranking state trooper with his chest puffed out. "Excuse me, officer." "Over here," Richard barked desperately, injecting his usual boardroom authority into a voice that was still shaking. "I am Richard Sterling. I am a Platinum Medallion flyer and the Executive Vice President of Sterling Commercial. I need a private car to Seattle immediately. This airline has completely compromised my safety. My luggage is still on that smoking death trap, and I have a multi-million-dollar closing at 8 in the morning. Mr. Sterling." The voice didn't come from the local police. It came from Captain David Mitchell. The pilot walked over his uniform, soaked through his face, pale and drawn. Flanking him were two stern, broad-shouldered men in dark windbreakers. One of them had FBI printed in bold, reflective yellow letters across the chest. Richard stopped, a smug, self-satisfied look crossing his mud-splattered face. He assumed the pilot was coming to apologize. "Yes, Captain. Thank you. Tell these local cops to get me a transport out of this wasteland. And I expect full compensation for this suit, my lost time, and the extreme emotional distress." Richard Sterling, the lead FBI agent, interrupted, stepping forward and flashing a gold federal badge that glinted in the harsh strobe lights of the fire engines. "Special Agent Miller, Seattle Field Office. You are under arrest for a Level 2 federal aviation violation, physical assault of a fellow passenger, and aggressive interference with a flight crew prior to a mid-air emergency." Richard's smug expression dissolved into absolute, uncomprehending horror. He took a step back, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "What? No. That is absurd. That was a misunderstanding. The plane dropped. She spilled my drink, and she hit me. I saw the whole thing." Officer Thomas Gregson stepped forward from the crowd of passengers, wrapping his blanket tightly around his broad shoulders. He glared at Richard with pure disgust. He grabbed her by the arm, yanked her out of her seat, left a bruise. Then he threatened to ruin her life and sue the crew. "I have it on video." A woman from row 2 added, stepping up beside Thomas and holding up her smartphone. The screen was brilliantly illuminated, playing the crystal-clear footage of Richard screaming, his face purple with rage, as he lunged at Mayer over the armrest. "I started recording the second he started yelling at her. It's already uploaded to the cloud." "You can have the original file, agent. You can't do this." Richard yelled, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch as Agent Miller grabbed him by the shoulder and forcibly turned him around. The agent pulled his arms behind his back with practiced, unforgiving efficiency. "I know the CEO of this airline. I am a wealthy man. I pay your salaries. You have no idea who you're messing with." The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly over Richard's expensive platinum PC, Philippe watch locking his wrists together. "Mr. Sterling," Captain Mitchell said, stepping close so Richard could see the absolute contempt burning in the pilot's eyes. "The only reason you are alive to complain right now is because of the young woman you assaulted. You are a small, arrogant man, and your money means absolutely nothing on my tarmac." Mitchell pointed across the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. Maya was standing near the open back doors of an ambulance. A black SUV with federal government plates had just breached the police barricade, sliding to a halt on the wet grass. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, holding an umbrella. It was Todd Citroen, the Chief Technology Officer for Boeing's commercial division. The FAA and Boeing Rapid Response Teams had been mobilized the second the plane dropped off the primary radar, and the regional director had immediately flown out from the Seattle headquarters. They had already been briefed via radio on how a totally blind, powerless aircraft had managed to find a runway in the middle of a storm. Todd Citroen wasn't looking at the damaged airplane. He was looking at Maya, and more specifically, at the glowing acrylic box resting safely in her arms. He extended his hand to her, his expression one of profound awe and immediate professional respect. Richard watched this unfold as he was being shoved into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the police cruiser. His head hit the doorframe as Agent Miller pushed him down through the rain-streaked window of the squad car. Maya looked over. She saw Richard handcuffed, soaked, and humiliated, staring back at her. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply gave him a slow, silent nod of acknowledgement, turned her back on him, and walked with the Boeing CTO into the warmth of the SUV to discuss the patent rights to the device that had just revolutionized aviation safety. Richard sat in the back of the cruiser, shivering violently in his ruined suit, the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He had survived the impossible flight. But as he watched Mia disappear into the VIP transport, the crushing weight of reality settled over him. His life as he knew it was over. The federal charges would carry prison time. His reputation was destroyed. His lucrative career was finished. And the viral video would ensure he was remembered only as the entitled coward who threw a tantrum while a brilliant young woman saved his life. The karma was absolute, inescapable, and infinitely more terrifying than the fall from 30,000 feet. The events of Flight 482 stand as a profound testament to the unpredictable nature of karma and the great equalizer of gravity. Up in the sky, artificial hierarchies of wealth status and corporate entitlement instantly dissolve when faced with the unforgiving laws of physics. Richard Sterling's descent from an arrogant executive to a handcuffed pariah serves as a stark reminder that true power does not reside in a bank account or a platinum medallion, but in intellect, grace under pressure, and basic human decency. Maya Jefferson didn't just save 150 lives that day. She proved that brilliance and courage can emerge from the most unexpected places, completely upending the toxic expectations of those who believe they own the child.